I'm Chris Shandek. Today on CYInterview, we welcome fight television commentator, former referee, and one of the most interesting people who can tell you anything about different fight promotions, fighting styles, and everything in general. The one, the only, and also, of course, the co-author of Is This Legal? Sean Wheelock is here with us. Sean, so great to finally have you on CYInterview after knowing you all these years. How are you, sir?
Great, Chris. Thank you so much for having me. Just before we got on air, we were reminiscing that it was 5 years ago this month,
Yep.
July 2018 in Las Vegas, when I saw you in person last. And that, of course, was the UFC Hall of Fame ceremony when Art Davie was inducted. And one of the big thrills of my life, Art, who I tell people he's my later in life father, had me give his introductory speech. And it was just an amazing night. It was great for me, but in a very selfless sense, because I truly love Art. And to see the man who created the UFC enshrined as the creator of the UFC and the UFC Hall of Fame was just absolutely incredible.
Well, I think we're going to talk about that. I wanted to mention that to you up front, but let's go back a second here. Of course, Art Davie's the man who made mixed martial arts mainstream in the world. I mean, it's the beginning. He's the co-founder of the first UFC ever. And interesting enough, of course, the 30th anniversary is this coming November. So looking back on writing Is This Legal? And of course, the story of the first UFC, what do you look back upon as we get to that 30th anniversary? And of course, then secondly, reflecting back on the induction speech you gave for Art at the UFC Hall of Fame here at the Palms in 2018 in Las Vegas.
Yeah, Chris, great question. And what I really look back, and if people haven't read the book, I would encourage them to, not just because we get the big 50 or 60 cent royalty per book, but
that's right,
to see the struggle. And here's what's lost to history. And I think for MMA fans who are 25 and younger, this is almost impossible to understand that this was an outlaw sport, that Art essentially had to trick his way into Colorado. Colorado had the Sabaki Challenge in Denver, and it was a full contact karate tournament. And he kind of tricked his way in that it was going to be some sort of karate tournament. Art will tell you now that if the authorities in Denver, if the authorities of the state of Colorado had understood what he was doing, they probably would have been shut down. And
sure.
As an aside, right. And as an aside, Is This Legal? The title comes from a pitch meeting that Art and his partner, Rorion Gracie, had to Chuck Norris. And Chuck Norris just kept saying, but is this legal? Like, Chuck Norris kept thinking that if he were involved, Art didn't want Chuck Norris to fight. He was in his 50s by that point, but to commentate, be an ambassador, be whatever he wanted, just be a professional Chuck Norris. But Chuck Norris thought the National Guard or the Marines or the FBI or the Colorado State Police were going to come in and shut this down. This was seen as an outlaw sport. A man named Jim Coleman, who was the editor of Black Belt magazine, wrote that it was dirty fighting. People from Dennis Alexio to Dan Gable told Art, absolutely not. I don't want to be involved. So to see 30 years later, as we're recording this, the UFC is on, and it's on a Disney property on ESPN. To see that it's gone from an absolutely illegal sport where Chuck Norris thinks the police are going to shut it down to being Disney-fied, and I mean that in the best possible sense. I mean, that's phenomenal. That's credit to Art, and that's just a massive shift that we've had in our culture.
Yeah, I mean, 30 years, a lot has changed, obviously. So, looking forward to that, then moving forward, having to induct the man who basically brought mixed martial arts to the mainstream in America, now across the world. What was that like back at the Palms in 2018 with Art, who, of course, is a multiple-time past CYInterview guest and friend as well?
Yeah, so I refer to Art as my later-in-life father, and just a little backstory. So my dad was about a generation older than my mom. I was raised by my mom. My dad was in my life, but I was most definitely raised by my mom, and I'm a product of my mom. My dad passed away in 2011. I met Art, maybe coincidentally, maybe not coincidentally, as I think about it, in 2011. And that really is what Art is. He's my later in life father. About 6 years ago, my older daughter, Ellie, put in Art in my phone as dad. And at first I kind of bristled, and I thought, no, you know what? That's actually pretty appropriate. An insight on Art Davie, my daughters, Ellie and Hadley, call him Grandpa Art. He sends them birthday gifts. He sends them Christmas gifts. He's their grandfather in their life. So people all the time say, oh, he's my brother, or he's my father. He's my, no disrespect to my actual dad, but Art Davie is my later in life father. Our friendship has gone to that of a later in life father and son. So while it felt natural that Art would ask me, I assumed nothing in life, and I was still thrilled because he could have asked Dan Severn. He could have asked John McCarthy. He could have asked Horion Gracie. He could have asked Randy Couture. There were so many people he could have asked who would have said yes, but he asked me. And that meant so much to me on a personal level.
Oh, it was a great speech. We were there for that. It was a wonderful evening that Art finally got to be celebrated in the way that he should be and be in the UFC Hall of Fame, of course. So then moving forward, let's talk about today. What is it like? Of course, Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship is the main one that you do a lot of commentating for, but you do a lot of ones for other fighting promotions. What is it like to be a traveling fight commentator? And there's just so many promotions now, and there's just something for everybody. And again, this is because of what Art envisioned almost 30 years ago.
Yeah, the way I'm wired, Chris, and because you know me, you probably know this. If someone said to me, all right, for X number of dollars, you can either do 10 shows a year or 50 shows a year, man, I'm taking the 50 because I love getting on a plane, flying to a different city, flying to a different country, and commentating fights. And something I'm really proud of right now, BKFC, which I'm infinitely proud of, is my main gig. But that I commentate. I just happen to have this on today because I wore this to the gym. This is my World Lightweight Championship t-shirt. They're out of business now. A lot of political problems in Myanmar, which we don't need to discuss. That ended the promotion. But the fact that I had a chance to go to Myanmar on multiple occasions and commentate Letway is something really amazing to me. The fact that I commentate bare knuckle, and I'm not bragging, of course, I'm from Kansas, I'm incapable of bragging, but just throughout my career that I've had the opportunity to commentate MMA, boxing, Letway, Muay Thai, bare knuckle, of course, submission grappling. I take a lot of pride in that. Weirdly, I was having this conversation with a friend of mine who's a lawyer for a lot of fighters. We were saying, there are boxing people and then there are fight people. I'm most definitely a fight guy. MMA is running through my DNA, I think, but I'm a fight guy. I love commentating fights. I love being at fights, whether that's BKFC or World Lightweight Championship, or I'm doing Triller Fight Club boxing, or doing MMA. I still do a number of shows on Fight Pass. I did Combat FC 2 weeks ago in Boston. I have Fighting Alliance Championship in Kansas City coming up in 2 weeks. I love commentating fights. And as much as I love MMA, to be able to commentate other fighting events and with BKFC, which I know we'll talk about in this interview, that's great. One thing when I was at Bellator, and I was there 2010 through 2015, I contractually could not do anything else. And I really wanted to do boxing. So I'm not talking bare knuckle now, I'm talking on boxing. The fact that I've had a chance to do a lot of boxing post Bellator in the last 7 years has been amazing for me. And the fact that I found, knock on wood, what I think is my home, and hopefully the last home professionally that I have in my career with BKFC, that feels really good too.
The thing of what it comes down to is because you've been a boxing referee or a fight commentator, you're commentating on all these different kinds of fight genres. What do you see like, of course, we go back to the 90s before the MMA, everybody would look at, of course, the next Tyson fight or the next Holyfield fight or the next Lewis fight. And then, of course, over the last, 20 to 30 years, now we look for the big MMA fights. And Floyd Mayweather was there, and there were a couple of others. But now we really only talk about the big boxing fights. And it seems like in recent years, boxing has been revitalized a little bit. So where do you think we are currently in the competition of boxing versus MMA versus everything in between?
I think that if I were 30 years younger, I might not watch boxing. Because I'm of an age where I was a kid. I was in high school when UFC 1 started. I had already been a boxing fan at that point for probably 10 years, maybe 11, 12 years. I don't remember a time when I wasn't a boxing fan. I'm talking like kindergarten or pre-kindergarten. I also loved pro wrestling. But if I were 30 years younger, I'm not sure that I would be watching boxing. And I think MMA has done a great job of taking the kids like me and making them MMA fans. A lot of that just has to do with accessibility. It's a lot easier and a lot more affordable to watch MMA than it is to watch boxing at the highest level. You can definitely find boxing, but to watch boxing at the highest level, there is a financial commitment that if you're raised by a single mom who's a public school art teacher, not making a lot of money, okay, we could afford to get us HBO. She wouldn't have been able to drop $125 on all of these rando pay-per-views. MMA has done a great job, I think, of embracing the fight community. This starts with art in 1993, and I do love boxing, but when I commentate boxing, it's such a different subculture. I don't see a lot of crossover from boxing to MMA. And again, I say this with love and respect to boxing, but generally speaking, boxing fans, real boxing fans, only pay attention to boxing. Real MMA fans pay attention to MMA, but they pay attention to boxing, BKFC. A regular boxing, regular MMA fan is going to watch maybe a random Top-Rank Boxing on ESPN, or at least watch the main event. The hardcore boxing fan, outside of maybe Conor McGregor or John Jones or when Ronda Rousey fought, they're just not going to do that. So for whatever reason, MMA to me over the last 30 years has been so inclusive. It's welcomed everybody in. It's been very open-minded, and I just think it's done a great job of targeting those people. Like I said, the version of me 30 years ago who was a boxing fan by default because that was the only fighting I could watch, MMA, led by the UFC, has just done a brilliant job of capturing that audience.
Well, the thing of what it comes down to, what's really interesting is obviously now we're looking about Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship. If you haven't seen any of it, watch them on YouTube. They're phenomenal. They're interesting. Is it just a combination of MMA and boxing together? Am I wrong to sum it up so simply? How would you describe it and why people should check it out?
So as we're coming up on the 30th anniversary of UFC 1, which is November 12th, 1993, we just passed the 5th year anniversary of the launch of Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship. And they've been doing bare knuckle boxing legally and sanctioned in the United Kingdom for about a decade. But that essentially is bare knuckle boxing. BKFC with David Feldman is bare knuckle fighting. The difference is really the clinch. Chris Lytle, who I think should be in the UFC Hall of Fame, and he's become one of my best friends and is my excellent broadcast partner on BKFC. You know the story. Chris has fights left on his contract. He beat Stan Hardy. He surprises everyone. He literally wanted to spend more time with his family. He retired, comes back at 44 because our buddy Joe Riggs had fought a bare knuckle boxing match in England. And Chris tells a great story. He's like, oh, man, what is Joe doing? What's wrong with our friend Joe? And then after a round, he's like, man, I got to call Joe after this fight and see how I can get in. Chris got sucked into it. He did one fight in England, and then he did 2 fights in BKFC before he became my commentary partner. Chris talked about when he was in England, it really felt like boxing without gloves. The rule set that David Feldman launched with bare knuckle fighting, which is what BKFC is, it has the active clinch. So if you're a high-level wrestler, a high-level grappler, a brown belt or a black belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, you're able to use those elements. I thought when the sport started and when we commentated BKFC 1 5 years ago, Chris, it was going to be literally that halfway line between boxing and MMA. It's not. It feels like an MMA show. 90, I'm guessing, but I'm saying 95, 96% of our fighters come from MMA rather than straight boxing. Our audience is an MMA crowd. It just has more of the MMA feel. Maybe it goes back to MMA fans have a tendency to be a little more open-minded when it comes to fighting. But with the exception of a few big-name fighters like Paulie Malignaggi, Austin Trout, who was fantastic beating Diego Sanchez earlier this year, Steve Aurelius, who's a Frenchman who lives in Florida, who was a cruiserweight champion for the WBC. We haven't really seen a lot of boxers, and even people who've come in with a good boxing pedigree and had a lot of success, like Reggie Barnett or James Lilly, also have MMA fights as well. So maybe there's the evolution of the sport that in 5 years or 10 years, boxing will be more involved. But right now, BKFC is a lot more like an MMA show. If you don't understand the clinch, if you don't understand overhooks, underhooks, how to hit a half tide plumb, a whizzer, a waist cinch, how to pummel, how to dirty box, you're probably not going to find real success in the sport. I was so impressed with Austin Trout in our fighter meeting. He said, man, I've been working with MMA fighters. I've been going to an MMA gym because I know that this isn't just boxing with gloves. We still see boxers, high-level boxers, who come in and say, yeah, this is just boxing without gloves. It's not. It's bare-knuckle fighting. And I'm having the time of my life. I've been so fortunate. I mean, pride with being there from Bellator from almost the beginning, doing 5.5 years there. But BKFC is for me, it's just an experience like I've never had. It's a great family. It's a great community. We love working for David Feldman. Lytle's become, as I said, one of my best friends, best broadcast partner I've ever had. And the fights are really fun. 5 2-minute rounds, and they cook.
I guess the question is that in the 5 years, where do you see the business expansion of BKFC right now, and what have you guys learned in 5 years about who you're reaching and how it's going through, and what you have to do to continue to expand that horizon?
I always tell David Feldman, who's the founder and the CEO of BKFC, that he's living Art Davies' life, and the parallels are uncanny. So you think about this, Art is launching a sport that everyone says is disgusting and the downfall of humankind. He goes to Colorado. David Feldman hears the same thing, and he goes to Wyoming. Art Davies' early states were in the South. Dave Feldman's early states were in the South. It took a long time, and it was a long, slow, painstaking, and ardent process to get MMA accepted. People forget MMA wasn't legal professionally in California until the 2000s. That's the same with Missouri. It's the same with my home state of Kansas. It was 2016, I believe, for pro MMA in New York. It's a long time. Again, there's sort of lost to history moments, but you think about this. In 1999, you couldn't have pro MMA in California. It wasn't until the Fertittas bought the UFC from Bob Meyerowitz, who had purchased it from Art Davie and Rorion Gracie, that they were able to get the UFC legalized in Nevada. So I see the parallels that BKFC, at first, people are like, oh, this is disgusting. This is awful. And then they see the medical data that it's not any less safe, and in some cases it's a lot safer than gloved boxing and MMA and Muay Thai and Letway. States are coming on board. We have next month the Association of Boxing Commissions annual convention. The name is a bit antiquated. Association of Boxing Commissions is really the associations of combat sports commissions. There are 47 of the 50 U.S. states that have athletic commissions. They're all governmental agencies, plus a number of areas in Canada. Some are provincial, some are through their city. There are a number of Native American tribes across the U.S. and Canada. They come together. The body is called the ABC. The annual convention will be putting forth, and I'm happy to be on that committee, the first ever unified rules. Once that happens, then I think you're going to see a lot more states come on board. But even now, you think that we have Florida, we're in Kansas, we're in Wyoming, the fact that we've done New Mexico, more states continue to come on board. It gets normalized. People always fear the unknown. People feared the UFC because they didn't know what it was going to look like. People feared BKFC and bare knuckle fighting. They didn't know what it was going to look like. Now with all the fights out there, it's normalized. And just like we're saying, you're able to watch through a Disney property, the UFC, where 30 years ago Chuck Norris thought he'd be arrested just for showing up. I think that's the exact same ascent of bare knuckle fighting championship.
Do you just feel like, and I'm going to say this to you, it's like you're, of course, been around for a long time following the fight game, but being a commentator for all of these major promotions and doing it on all the different levels, do you just feel like you've got an inside look to this world that most people could never understand?
Yeah, I do. And I don't take that for granted to be part of this community and this culture. Again, I do not take that for granted. It's a small world. You know that, Chris. And so many people who I've worked with on one show, I'll work with on another show. One of the real pleasures for me on BKFC is that I have reunited with so many people who I considered real friends at Bellator, who I didn't know if I would commentate again. People like David Rickles, people like Mike Richmond. That's been fantastic. People who I commentated in other things. I did Mike Perry and Chael Sonnen in Submission Underground, and he's there. People who I idolized as fighters, like my buddy Chris Lytle, like Thiago Alves, like Chris Lieben, Gabriel Gonzaga. I've had a chance to commentate as well. So I don't take any of that for granted. But yeah, it is most definitely an industry. The fight industry, and when you're in it, you understand it's a business. You understand the politics of it, for good and bad. You see all the moving parts and pieces. So, as an example, a lot of fans are looking at, wow, I wonder if Bellator is going to get bought. What's happening to that? My thought is, what about my friends who fight for Bellator? And I guess my only friend who still works for Bellator is Big John McCarthy, who came in after me. But I still, like Austin Vanderford, still have friends on that roster, the Pitbull brothers. You have to wonder about that. That, I think, when you work in this industry, is stuff that you see and maybe you pay attention to more than if you're just a fan.
Oh, sure, no denying that. So, interesting fun fact about you is you did some work for the Kansas Athletic Commission back in the day. What do you think about the state of fighting and the rules and the safety of the fighters? And where do you think we are overall? Where have we made progress, and where are we still behind?
Yeah, I love that question. So I did 2 terms on the Kansas Athletic Commission, and a lot of people think that I was like running the commission. So every state commission is different. In Kansas, there's the executive director. That's now a woman called Alejandra Prieta, who does a fantastic job. My buddy Adam Rohrbach had that for 8 years before. He now works for us at BKFC. But then there are 5 governor-appointed commissioners. Now, I'll say this. Governor Kelly has no idea who I am. There's an appointment secretary. There's a lot of commissions in Kansas. So there's the Healing Arts. There's Native American Affairs. There's business development. So I was appointed by a Republican, and then I was appointed by a Democrat. So I kept my politics to myself on that. But being appointed and serving 2 terms on the Kansas Athletic Commission allowed me to really get involved in fighter safety and fairness, which is what I care for a lot. The biggest thing that I would still like to see, and which I think is a major problem, is that we don't have quality control on referees and judges. And so often that's up to the state athletic commission. I'm a big fan of some sort of national training, national licensing. I used to be a soccer commentator in a previous life before I was a fight commentator. And it's not apples to apples, because you can have a governing body in the United States Soccer Federation, whereas every state has their own autonomy. The ABC is a collective, but they don't have federal mandates or federal authorities beyond ID cards. Even suspensions. People don't really understand this, even fighters. There's no such thing as a national suspension. States usually and commissions honor a suspension. There's no such thing as a national suspension. It does not exist. So it's tough to get things through at a national level, but I would still love to see through the ABC and the commissions come together and have some sort of tier program like I saw with the United States Soccer Federation. So there are tiers of referees and assistant referees and 4th officials have that. So whether you're in Missouri or you're in New Hampshire or you're in California, maybe you have an A license or a B license or a C license or a D license, or you've had the complete training. Because I would look at from the regulatory side is it's really only about 2 things in this order: fighter safety and fighter fairness. That's really all we're talking about here. So many people get into, well, I want to be the matchmaker. They must be frustrated promoters. I don't know about this 6-1 guy facing this 3-3 guy. You see fights get killed by that. I hate that. I also don't think a commission should ever think that they're the arbiter of taste or good taste or bad taste. It's fighter safety and fighter fairness. Within those parameters, why should you be penalized as a fighter because you happen to be in a state that doesn't have a great athletic commission, and maybe their MMA referee is somebody who's a lifelong boxing guy who's never grappled or doesn't understand, or maybe their boxing judge is somebody's husband who gave money to a governor and they got on board, or they're somebody's next door neighbor. That's not right to me. That's the next step that I would like to see, but I'm still not sure how that's really done because, again, there's no federal mandate. There's no federal authority.
Do you think there could ever be one?
You know what? It would literally would take an act of Congress. You would literally have to have a presidential administration want to basically appoint like a fight czar, and then say we're going to take that in. But then it gets into these issues of states' rights and things like that. But fighters don't even understand this or are aware of this. Is that you're fighting almost in a different country. So, for instance, I live in a Kansas City suburb called Shawnee, where I'm speaking to you from. I'm about 15 minutes from the state line. There are fights in Missouri. There are fights in Kansas. Two different rule sets are being used specifically on the grounded fighter. Different referees. There's some crossover, not much. The judges, there's no crossover. Fighters sometimes are like, well, am I fighting in Missouri or Kansas? They don't even think about that because it's one city with the state line. But your results can be vastly different depending on what state you're in terms of who your referee, in terms of who your judges are, in terms of if there are inspectors, in terms of what's the training of this doctor. Is it a real fight physician? Or was this somebody's neighbor who's a general practitioner who's retired and has never been to a fight in their life and hasn't sutured since they were in med school? I would love to see that done, but again, it gets into a states' rights issue, and it would literally take an act of Congress led by a president of the United States to say we need some sort of national fighting commission.
Well, it's getting bigger and bigger every year, the fight world is. Just in closing, Sean, we're going to have you back a bunch of times because it's just so much fun talking with you about fighting and the state of fighting today and all those kinds of things. And what else is going on with you that we haven't discussed in these last 27 minutes almost?
Well, Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship continues to roll, and I'll plug BKFC. I would say that there were a lot of prejudgments on what the fights would look like, but we're through 5 fights or 5 years, so I was trying to do the math. I think we're somewhere around 900 or 1,000 fights. I would say if you're an MMA fan, you will love it, and if you're just a boxing fan, give it a chance, and I think you will come to love it. It's fast. It's really fun. With that said, I still commentate MMA. I still commentate boxing. I do everything else. That's just my number one show by the volume and the scope of how big that is. But like earlier this year, I got to do the Roy Jones Jr. versus Anthony Pettis card for Game Bread, which was a lot of fun. I'm just out there plugging. I love doing fights. If I'm not commentating, there's a good chance I'm at a house show in Kansas or Missouri, just watching, just trying to support the sport. I will plug my book if that's all right. The book,
of course,
which is
you're
called
absolutely allowed to.
Thank you. Is This Legal? The Inside Story of the First UFC from the Man Who Created It, written by Art Davey and myself. You can find it on Amazon. I will tell you that we have the better price. Art and I have some personal inventory. I think we have it up for an autographed copy for $15 or $20. It's a lot more expensive at Barnes & Noble or Amazon. It's isthislegalthebook.com, isthislegalthebook.com. You can get an autographed copy just with Art and me, or not an autographed copy. Again, there's not a lot of money in book publishing, so it's not a hustle to get that 50 or 60 cent commission. If anybody is interested in really how the UFC began, what the climate, the culture was like in the United States in the late 80s and early 90s, and how it pertained to martial arts and fighting, then I would hope that that's the book for you. But it's a true story. I didn't let Art get away with any fabrications. I had a lot of verification in that, including from Big John McCarthy, who was there from the beginning as a student at the Gracie Academy alongside Art Davey. So the book's 8 years old now, and professionally, that's the thing I'm most proud of.
Oh, there's no denying it's a phenomenal book, and you and Art are both great for many different reasons. So,
thank you.
In closing, fight commentator for the Bare Knuckle Fighting Championship, Sean Wheelock, and a former referee, and is announced for every single major fighting organization there basically is on earth. Thank you so much for joining us on CYInterview today.
Chris, my pleasure, man. Thank you. Yeah, thank you. No, I want to say thanks to you, man. You're always a great supporter of mine, and I appreciate what you do for the fight community. Happy to be on with you anytime.
Thank you for watching today's CYInterview segment from Las Vegas. Please hit the like button and please hit the subscribe button to be updated on all future CYInterview content from Las Vegas and beyond.